Okay, we are live. Welcome back to Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. It is Wednesday, January 22nd. Hard to believe. Time marches on. And this morning we're going to begin with some of our work and reports from last year that we asked for. And we have with us the chair of the report of the Agricultural Worker Labor and Employment Law Study Committee, which really addressed the sub-minimum wage which agricultural workers in this state are subject to. And you had several of our committee members with you. I think Randy served on that, and Acacia and Brian Collmore and Irene were your senators. So we would love to have you tee it up. And I hope in the 45 minutes we have, we're going to get a good sense of what you came to consensus, what you came to agreement on, what you passed, what you learned about sub-minimum wage, and about agricultural workers generally. And it is yours. Welcome, David Durfee. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
And good morning to the committee. For the record, David Durfee, representatives from Shaftesbury, Bennington District, and yes, as you said, chair of the no longer extant Agriculture, Worker, Labor, and Employment Law Study Committee that met this summer and fall and produced the report that you have in front of you. And I wanted to start just with a little bit of background. I'll cover some of the things that you suggested I cover. Chair Clarkson.
It's yours to do what you want.
Okay. And then since we have legislative counsel following me, she'll clean up and correct everything that I got wrong and fill in all the blanks.
Thank goodness for legislative counsel.
Yes. And we did have, it was an 8-person committee. So we had the 4 senators that you mentioned, including 2 from this committee, and then 4 House members. And they're all listed on the front here, so don't need to name them, but it was a House Senate, balanced committee. The background, when the federal government nearly 90 years ago passed legislation allowing workers to work collectively to bargain in employers and farm unions, they excluded agricultural workers from those laws. And when in the 1970s, Vermont and other states passed legislation to allow workers in various sectors to organize, they also excluded agricultural workers from the right to bargain. So there are no unionized farm workers in the state of Vermont. Other states over the years have passed legislation that does allow farm workers to organize. And part of the work that we did was to look at what other states have done. There are 14 states that have enacted legislation. Some of them are states that you would say, oh, right, California, that makes sense. Other states that are more conservative also have passed that legislation. None of them, I think, terribly recently. This is not breaking news. It's been in some of these laws in place for a while. So
a lot of that background is in this report.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think there's anything I'm going to share with you that's probably not in the report.
But it's helpful to hear. Was there any correlation between the bargaining that got put into place and the size of the state and the size of that workforce, of that ag workforce?
Well, Massachusetts I'm thinking of nearby states. The smaller states in New England, no. Maine did pass recently through its legislature laws that would have accomplished this. The governor vetoed it, I think as recently as 2020. But other small states, I'm going to defer to Ledge Council to be specific.
Yeah. Keep going. Sorry, I didn't.
Good morning. We were also we were also made aware, and I say we, the legislature, a year ago, that In addition to those laws excluding farm workers are some of our employment laws. Minimum wage, for example, also exclude agricultural workers. So a farm worker in Vermont is not subject to minimum wage laws, or employers of farm workers are not subject to minimum wage laws in Vermont. So a year ago, the legislature passed a bill, S-102, that included formation of this study committee and charged us with coming back with recommendations on if we were to pass a law that allowed collective bargaining, what would that look like? These laws are not always straightforward, so what would that look like? And also to make any other recommendations on the employment side, so minimum wage, overtime, other areas where farm workers are currently excluded. So we met 6 times over the course of about 3 months. So we'll start it in August and met here in Montpelier for the better part of the day and took testimony from lots of people who you would expect you would want to hear from. We heard from farmers. We heard from dairy farmers in Vermont. We heard from dairy farmers and other farmers, both in Vermont and not in Vermont, from out of state. We took testimony from the State Labor Relations Board, which governs or assists with disputes and union elections, to find out what their capacity would be like if they were to also then have to deal with a new sector, with the ag sector. We heard from the counterparts to the Labor Relations Board in other states, Massachusetts, I guess specifically, partly because we wanted to find out what it was like and what, whether that additional, whether they had found that they had the capacity when they had added those laws. Of course, it was long enough ago that it wasn't easy to answer that. But one of the things that we learned from Massachusetts was that even though their law has been in place allowing workers to bargain for quite a while, and I'm going to say quite a while, but I think it's by the order of 40 or 50 years, they had never certified union, a farm workers union, until recently, and I'm going to say within the past decade, when Massachusetts legalized recreational cannabis. And
cannabis drove it.
Yeah, so the operation growing cannabis, some of those workers decided to bargain. So despite having that law in the books, it had never happened in Massachusetts specifically. New York, and more recently, I guess New York is a neighboring state that more recently changed their law, and they have had some farm workers organize and we begin to bargain collectively. So I will maybe just jump to our sort of at a high level what our recommendations were. We had a group of 8, and we were able to agree on a few things. The group of the 8 of us. One specifically was that the legislature, looking to the legislature that's now seated or a future legislature, ought to focus first on the employment side of the question rather than the labor side of the question. So employment laws like minimum wage, rather than trying to stand up a collective bargaining system. So again, the minimum wage in Vermont does not currently apply to farm workers. The federal minimum wage actually does. Just I'll point that out. The federal minimum wage is considerably lower. It's I think $7.25. Yeah. So almost just a little bit more, bigger than half of what our minimum wage is now. We took testimony from some farmers saying that they already are paying minimum wage in the labor market that we have now. many employers are paying more than the minimum wage. We didn't hear that necessarily consistently, but we felt that that was the one thing that we could sort of suggest we should start with that. So we weren't unanimous on recommending that, but I think that was maybe the second priority. A closely related question is overtime pay, closely related to wages. Again, in Vermont, agricultural workers currently are exempt from the rules automatically, so they don't qualify automatically if you're working over 40 hours. And we know that farm work in general is an area where people are working more than 40 hours. Let me pause there just to see if there are questions.
I guess I have a question. Thank you for your work, Randy and Keisha, on this with David. I guess one of my questions is, it's many of our farmers are paying more than they're paying our current minimum wage, but they deduct out of that certain things. They deduct out of the minimum wage certain things. Could you elaborate on what they're allowed to deduct and still by law are there legal limits to what they're able to deduct?
Right. So housing may be one of the areas that would come to mind. Many of our dairy farmers, our larger dairy farmers, provide housing to their farm workers, and they are allowed to deduct. I would characterize it as a fairly modest amount under law. I'm going to leave it to legal counsel to spell out what that is.
Okay, well, Sophie we'll hear from Sophie.
Yes. But the short answer anyway is yes, they can deduct it. But I think when the committee looked at it, our sense was, no, that makes sense. It didn't seem as though it was over the top.
And it was not a common practice. It wasn't like most farmers who provide housing are taking that standard deduction out of wages. That we didn't hear. We heard they're generally going above the minimum wage in Vermont on the farming side, from farmers, from the farm worker side. Their survey indicated that they have maybe a quarter, and so if you can share the exact numbers of people who reported making less than state minimum wage.
The data was disparate and not in agreement, and someone said some concerns about relying on data that was so different.
Got it. And inconsistent.
I guess if we brought those stakeholders back in, I don't know that they would say it's that different. I mean, if the farmers say a majority of our members paid more than minimum wage, and the farm worker side, they say about a quarter of people report having less, that's not necessarily incongruent. I think everyone's reluctant to talk about the full reality on the ground because of questions of who they're hiring and their status in the country.
And that leads some of us to say that the only way we're going to have reliable data is if someone independent of the people who have the stake in it on both sides of the issue are involved. And
that may be coming down the pike at some point soon, because the data trust is an issue that we're going to be addressing at some point. And it's one of the things our consultants last year recommended.
Can I?
Cool.
It's a bit of a question and a bit of a reality. I mean, we were not looking at the potential reality of losing a lot of our dairy workers, or I think we were able to find agreement and have the conversation that there are a lot of undocumented people who are in our dairy industry, and they matter a lot to the functioning of the dairy industry. I don't think that was in dispute.
Yes.
When we had our immigration task force that I co-chaired for TJ Donovan in 2017, we had someone from the Franklin Dairy Co-op, Leon Barthune, who participated in that task force and talked about these folks being like family and how to participate in non-cooperation legally, you know, what your rights and responsibilities are in terms of non-cooperation with federal immigration
Yeah.
agents. So that wasn't touched by our committee, but I believe it's incumbent on the Agriculture or Economic Development Committee at some point. I hope I'm wrong to take up the question of what happens to our dairy industry if people are deported en masse.
I agree, and that's a huge subject, and it would be decimated. That leads me to my question, which is what percent of our farm workers in Vermont are undocumented?
We,
Nobody wants to talk.
Well, we need to know it.
Yeah, we took testimony on that, and I'm gonna say, and I may be wrong, I may be conflating it with a nationwide number, but I think that somewhere around half, possibly.
And
Significant number.
right.
Right.
Well, anything else you'd like us to sort of the big picture of what you could come to agreement on? So you had a 6-2 vote.
I think-
I think on this.
Yeah, I think just going back to the collective bargaining side where we had broad agreement that while farm workers we all agree farm workers are essential workers in our economy, in keeping us fed, that the process of unionizing is an expensive one for all parties, resource intensive at first, and that we might accomplish some of the goals that parties might have by looking at our employment laws specifically. So,
Right. Great. Thank you very much for your work. Thank you, Keisha and Randy, for your work.
thank you for having me in.
Yes, it ties nicely into some of our themes and objectives for the year, and also ties into agricultural housing, which we will be discussing at some point soon.
I think it's just helpful to say with the chair present, with our counterpart chair present, that I will be drafting a proposal with Sophie on the minimum wage and the overtime piece for our committee to consider. So,
Right.
we never got to talk about, is there a path or what the path looks like in the legislature? And I at least want us to have that conversation. And it may go to agriculture after us.
Good. I just wanted to say also that we found, and you two can concur or not, but I should say I found that the time we had to do the work was limited. In retrospect, we had 6 meetings. There was a lot of material to cover. We did provide outlines for a framework of collective bargaining in some cases. We were able to fill in, answer some of the questions that we were charged with, but in other cases, we just didn't have the time to do the research. So as Sophie's walking through it, she'll point out, here are things where the committee said, if there were a scenario someday where we were thinking about allowing unions in the sector, the committee would recommend doing it this way. And then other things where the committee didn't have a recommendation. So,
but it sounds like maybe walking before we run is a good idea. And we may have a larger. Let's chat about a wage bill, because I think I'm hoping we'll have actually a wage growth bill that in part addresses agricultural workers and in part addresses everybody else. Thomas, did you have a question?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, is the fact that there appears to be some uncertainty from the legal perspective, and so you may.
So Sophie's going to come up next.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's ask that then. David, thank you
All right,
very
thank you.
much. And thank you for your chairing it, and thank you for chairing ag upstairs. Ag and forestry.
and food.
Go defend our forests. And food, right. Thank you. Yeah, right. Sophie, welcome.
Yeah, good morning. For the record, I'm Sophie Zadatny. I'm legislative counsel. And I sort of took over from Damien Leonard in terms of staffing the committee, and Damien couldn't be here today. He had a conflict. He was double booked. So, but I was worked with the committee on the report. So it made sense for me to be the one to be here.
Can I just say something before Sophie starts?
Of course you may.
We are so lucky to have Sophie in this role. I mean, you know, we were incredibly lucky to have Damien. He was wonderful. And it would have been, you know, just really hard for anyone to fill his shoes. But my gosh, Sophie just picked up this task force and all of the work and ran with it. And I'm just really glad that we have you in this role.
We're very lucky to have the former chancellor of the Vermont State
It
University.
had nothing to do with agriculture.
And
Really legal mind.
and a former lawyer at Dinzy Knapp. I mean, and such an accomplished legal counsel.
And
Yeah,
she did a
joining this
wonderful
team.
job at chasing down members who failed to sign the document, and she did so in a very pleasant but very consistent way.
I'm a good nagger.
She's also a mother, so she's learned
Yes,
all those
yes.
lessons too. So welcome again.
Thank
It's
you.
lovely to have you again.
Thank you.
And it's terrific that you're bringing all those skills and talents to bear on this issue. So
Well, I will say, I mean, one of the benefits of coming in October was I did have time. Damien had other things he was finishing up and transitioning to his new role. So I did have time to really deep dive. So, the report really captures, I think, all the work the committee did and all the research that was done. I'm not going to go through all of that, but if anyone is interested, all that information is here. So
Great number.
I think that was really the goal, was to make sure that for any discussion that moves forward, there's a resource that can be easily accessed that has all that information in it. And I would encourage, you know, certainly on the comparative information that Representative Durkee was talking about, in Appendix 4, there's a matrix that compares both
Yes.
on the union side, but also minimum wage, overtime, workers' comp, and then a couple of other issues that came up for the committee: field sanitation, pesticide safety, and then the recreational cannabis. And again, links to everything that's in there. The committee also did hear information about our agricultural sector, which I think is important to keep in mind. I think to the question that you raised before around other states that allow unionization, the ones where there's more active laws, both on the employment side, I would say the overtime, the minimum wage, allowing collective bargaining, are much bigger states with far greater resources than we have. I think one of the interesting things that was information that was presented was particularly from the USDA's census on agriculture, and then really that information did a deep dive on Vermont's agricultural sector. For example, out of all the farms in Vermont, and there are about the same number of farms, but a significant number have shifted out of dairy and are now doing other, you know, Christmas trees and turkeys and other things. Only 1/3 actually have any agricultural employees. So
only 1/3 of all farms.
yes. So to be for the USDA census, you just need $10,000 worth of produce to qualify as a farm. So, you know, I think it's important to remember the scale of what we're looking at for a lot of the Vermont farms. So that information is in the report. So again, the earlier sections really go through some of those that data from the USDA census. We review the legislative charge that the committee was asked to perform, the collective bargaining rights for agricultural workers. And again, these vary widely. So some states, you know, Louisiana, Hawaii, I mean, there are just a huge variety of states that have collective bargaining statutes. Some of them have separate agencies that oversee agricultural collective bargaining statutes. Others have it incorporated within their public statutes. So as Representative Durfee was saying, agricultural workers were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act back in the 1930s. Vermont has the State Labor Relations Act that seeks to fill in the gaps that the National Labor Relations Act doesn't fill. But again, even within the State Labor Relations Act, which covers essentially public employees, the exclusions of agricultural workers, domestic workers, were excluded in the act that just passed last session. Domestic workers, if there are 5 or more, are able now to unionize under the State Labor Relations Act.
Just add on what Sophie was saying about the exclusions from the original National Labor Relations Act in the 1930s. The principal reason for the exclusion was race. Because people in the category of farm workers and domestic workers were, to a great extent, African American, and the act was purposely designed to exclude those folks from coverage.
Thank you. Not, sadly, not surprising. But
Yeah. It's important.
yeah, no, it is a good reminder.
Yeah. Yeah. So the committee, I think, as Representative Duffy explained, we did spend a lot of time looking at collective bargaining around the country. There was a consensus from the committee, and the first recommendation was essentially to focus elsewhere and not to focus on collective bargaining for the reasons that Representative Duffy mentioned. In terms of just looking nationally, what's been accomplished in those states where agricultural workers can unionize, the reality has been that very rarely do they unionize. And there may be a variety of reasons for that. But if the issue is addressing the actual working conditions of agricultural workers, then the committee's sense was better to focus on minimum wage and overtime rather than collective bargaining. I would
do that walking before we run.
Right, and I would just point out, the committee did look at other employment laws that are applicable to agricultural workers. Those are also listed in the report, and essentially they are covered by most of Vermont's other employment laws. The 2 big exceptions are the minimum wage and the overtime.
And you said that I believe you said that some of the states that had enacted collective bargaining had then rescinded some of it. That's not the right word. But had decertified some of the unions that had been set up.
So in Massachusetts, agricultural workers were able to unionize starting in 1970, and none of them did until 2020. And then when cannabis growing became legal, there were 9 requests to certify collective bargaining units. 9 were certified, but 3 have since decertified. In New York, the committee received a fair amount of testimony, particularly from the farmer side of things, in terms of how that's working in New York. And I think it appears it's been quite confrontational, I would say. So there's still a lot of, there are petitions out there to certify. There's a lot of legal action going on. So it wasn't clear how many agricultural bargaining units have been certified in New York. There's clearly activity. One of the interesting things in New York is that H-2A visa holders were targeted primarily with the unionization drive. A number of states do not allow H-2A workers to unionize, and partly because they're very heavily regulated at the federal level.
H-2A, agricultural workers, seasonal.
Right, who are non-immigrants. So they come into the US for up to 10 months and then go back to their home country. And you had asked Representative Duffy around the numbers of I think people use the term migrant workers, which is not really a good term to use because it's very confusing. That data is in the report. The USDA census would include migrant workers as being H-2A workers that are migrant, that are coming here and then going home, or it could be within the US. It could be, US citizens that migrate around doing work. And so those are the ones that are considered migrant workers for the USDA census. Whereas the undocumented workers in Vermont are largely here permanently. They're not migrating back to a home country or to another state.
Or following crops. I mean, in
Right,
California, you
right.
just follow the crops.
Well, and here we follow crops too, because the orchard industry, all the fruit industry has a huge number of H-2A visa holders. And then there are also certain vegetable crops that where they follow, So we have some of that in our state.
And the H2A workers are, under the federal law, they're guaranteed a much higher rate, right? Currently it's $17.80. Well, it was for 2024. I don't know if that's changed for 25. So they're above current Vermont minimum wage, and they also get free transport and free housing. So the other question that came up with Representative Durfee was around room and board deduction rates, and I can share this with the committee separately, but there is the Commissioner of Labor puts out each year what deductions are allowed. And I think as Representative Durfee indicated, they're relatively modest. So full room is $31.64 a week. Full room and board is $109.24 a week for 2025. So they're not, the market rate, so to speak, they're capped as to what an employer can charge by way of a deduction for those. I can share that with the committee.
Right. And of the, anything else you want to cover, or anything that Keisha and Randy want to make sure we cover in our next 7 or 8 minutes, because we're, just to remind us, we're going upstairs, room right above us, for our landlord tenant update with House General. Anything else? Yeah. Keisha.
So, I mean, I don't know if we can put too fine a point on it, but in many situations, I think you'd hear me advocating for unionization, and that's, likely to help people. I don't even know if it's a walk before we run kind of thing, because if you are undocumented, and particularly in this political climate, unionization is probably nowhere in the cards, if it hasn't been for years. So, really I think we should just end our focus on that here and now. And what I think became really interesting and rich for conversation beyond the minimum wage change, which would be fairly straightforward, yes or no, if you feel we should take away their exemption from minimum wage, is a lot of states treat overtime very differently, and they're working out how they do that. So I don't even know, I don't want to misspeak about the proposal I have in for us to consider, but it's something at over 60 hours of work you would be considered for overtime, because many states, they might have started at 60 and they're trying to take it back to like over 55 hours or 50 hours. But, at some point we do simply take away work and opportunity for people if we are too limiting of the number of hours, because, more hours, more money people earn in a very round the clock industry. And, at some point, then I think it's worth it for us to have a health and safety conversation about, at some point when you're working too many hours, that might be where people want to talk about, injuries and health issues and safety. Because that came up in our conversation. We didn't do very much to address it directly, reports of not having a washing machine or being able to get enough sleep, or, sleeping very close to the cows, or in substandard housing, or, being kicked and not being able to access medical care. But I think for now, that's worth tying into an overtime conversation.
So just because we are also the housing committee, and farm worker housing has been an issue for us, and something we'll be addressing this year. What percent you said 1/3 of all farms that have workers, what percent of that group of farmers that have additional workers and have farm workers, what percent of them provide housing?
The committee didn't get
You didn't
specific
get it.
data on that.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it was part of
It was-
compensation, so I would have thought you would have had that conversation.
It came up sort of indirectly
Mhm.
when there was a discussion around the minimum wage. I think from the Vermont Dairy Producers Alliance indicated that if you take into account the housing and everything else, they're paying well above minimum wage, like $23 an hour, I think was one number. it wasn't clear what percentage are in housing. We did have testimony from Library of Justice around the Milk with Dignity program and then the changes that's brought with regard to housing. And that's improved housing and the commitment that farms that are part of that program make around housing. But I don't recall that there was any specific number, and I don't recall that being in the USDA census, which is where there was a lot of information. I could go back and look and see it.
I think the Milk with Dignity program also, there's a limitation on the number of people, farm workers who are involved in that statewide, so I don't think that's necessarily standard by any means.
And it also crossed the
Yeah.
New York as well. I mean,
Right. I mean, I think at some level, we started to focus very specifically on dairy, right? So if you're talking about going in the daytime to pick vegetables or something, you probably get a few more young people who are citizens and residents, et cetera, versus the dairy industry being 24 hours a day. I would say a vast majority of them are living very close to the milking parlor. And that because we all have such a hard time getting housing, and particularly anyone who's undocumented, I would say the vast majority are being housed.
Yeah, that's my sense.
But that's dairy.
Well, it would be just interesting to get a sense of how many undocumented are working in some of the farms beyond dairy. But I think my sense is just like yours, is that most undocumented workers are in dairy and working in the dairy industry.
the other piece I wanted to add
Yeah.
to what Senator Ron Hinsdale just said about the overtime was the committee did look at if there was to be an overtime provision at 60 hours or whatever for agricultural workers,
Right.
would there be some way to compensate farmers for the added cost? So in New York, there is actually a tax program where they get a tax incentive or they get tax credits. I've got the information, I can't remember it all off the top of my head, but essentially to help minimize the impact of the overtime rules in New York. And so there was some discussion at the committee, no decision, but are there other funds that are currently going to farms, to agriculture, that could be repurposed to help support farmers that are providing overtime? So that there was a discussion around that. There wasn't a specific recommendation, although I recall that two of the members of the committee were in favor of exploring overtime if there was some mechanism by which you could help alleviate the burden on the farmers.
So I have a pretty good sense of what your recommendations are and what my guess is for the backbone of your bill, which I think this is great. And I'm looking forward to looking at this as part of our wage growth efforts in this year. This has long been an issue in this committee,
And I think
and it's great that we're finally going to be addressing it.
there are a number of things in the recommendations that you'll see it towards the end of the report where the committee members felt that, the committee's jurisdiction really needs to do a deeper dive on this or need to look more at that. So
So as we set up the witnesses on that, I'll rely on all of you to help identify those that we need to hear from on the deeper dive. Great. Anything else before we?
no, if the committee's interested, I will share with Heidi the from the Department of Labor, the update of room and board deduction rates, just so you're aware of that. It was provided to the committee. It's on the study committee's website, but I can provide it.
Oh, that would be great. And then we'll
Heidi.
post it along with this.
And as with so many things, it's a great report, worth reading, and as many questions I think can be answered about the numbers and the data, how accurate or imperfect it is even taken into account. I think Sophie wrote a great report on the state of farm workers to the information that we do have available, and it's the first several pages.
Yeah, no,
We're flipping through.
I looked at them last night. It's a great report. It is amusing to see the signatures. I'm just saying, it is amusing.
Oh, I think I did mine on the phone.
I know it was.
That's like a John Hancock right there.
It's like everybody, it's in the 21st century as we edge towards the middle of the century. It is amusing to see how all those signatures been collected and how they're represented in this report.
Well, I was really pushing for that 12:15 deadline. It did land up being 12:17 by the time we got them all, but
Anyway,
we tried.
more to follow.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And with that, we will